The soil was cracked, a dusty graveyard of broken dreams where nothing had grown for decades. Elias, a man whose pockets were as empty as his fields, didn't buy the land because he was a visionary, he bought it because he was desperate. Everyone in the village laughed, calling it the Devil's Acre, a cursed patch of earth where life went to die. But on a Tuesday, under a moonless, heavy sky, Elias dug a single hole, not for a seed, but for a rotting trunk he found half buried. What he pulled out would rewrite the history of this valley, transforming his poverty into something the world would fight to possess. This wasn't just a discovery, it was the trigger for a chain reaction that turned a quiet rural life into a high-stakes struggle for survival. And it all started with a mistake. The transition from a man of labor to a man of destiny rarely happens with fanfare. For Elias, it started with the deafening silence of a farmhouse that hadn't seen a harvest in 3 years. He stood at the edge of his property line, a boundary defined by rusted barbed wire and the hollow ache of hunger. This was the reality of the smallholder farmer, a life tethered to the whims of rain and the harsh geometry of debt. The village, perched on the hill above his dilapidated plot, watched him with a mixture of pity and smug superiority. They knew the land, they knew its history of failed crops and broken plows. Elias, however, held on to the property deed like a lifeline, believing that even in the most neglected corners of the world, there was a secret waiting to be unearthed. The atmosphere of the village was thick with stagnation. It was a place where progress was viewed with suspicion, and the only thing that grew reliably was gossip. Elias was the subject of the month. He had sold his only cow to secure the down payment for this forgotten field, a decision that had alienated him from his few remaining neighbors. They called him a fool, he called it a gamble. The landscape was dominated by rolling hills, but his section was a flat, barren basin that seemed to swallow the light. It felt hostile, almost intentional in its refusal to nurture life. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the dust, Elias noticed a strange anomaly near the northern boundary. It wasn't a rock, and it wasn't a root. It was a metal edge, glinting with a dull, oxidized sheen that didn't match the surrounding iron-rich clay. He knelt, his calloused fingers scraping away layers of packed dirt that had likely been undisturbed for half a century. As he cleared the debris, the form revealed itself, a heavy, iron-bound chest, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to writhe in the dim light. This was the moment the narrative of his life shifted. He wasn't just a farmer anymore, he was a custodian of something forgotten. He felt the cold iron against his skin, a sharp contrast to the feverish heat of his own desperation. He dragged the object toward his small shed, his pulse echoing in his ears like a drum. He didn't open it immediately. There was a primal instinct, a sense of foreboding that told him if he cracked the seal, he could never return to the simplicity of his previous life. He spent the night sitting on his porch, listening to the wind howl through the eaves, wondering if the village elders were right about the curse. But as the first light of dawn touched the horizon, he realized that he didn't care about curses. He cared about the void in his stomach and the crushing weight of his failure. He grabbed a heavy crowbar, took a breath, and approached the chest. The lock gave way with a sound like a bone snapping. Inside, there were no gold coins or jewels, at least not in the sense he expected. Instead, there were bundles of yellowed parchment, sealed in wax, and a set of tools made from a metal that looked like silver but felt as heavy as lead. These weren't tools for farming. They were tools for excavation, for surveying the impossible. Elias began to read. The parchment spoke of a subterranean river, a vein of mineral-rich water that flowed deep beneath the crust of the valley, a geological anomaly that had been hidden by a cataclysmic shift centuries ago. He realized that the village hadn't been built on a poor plot of land, it had been built on a reservoir of untold potential, ignored because the ancestors had been too terrified to look beneath the surface. He didn't sleep that night. He spent the hours by candlelight, mapping the lines described in the ancient documents. He saw the structure of his field not as a square of dirt, but as a grid of energy. He understood then why the land had remained forgotten. It wasn't cursed, it was protected. The previous owners hadn't been failures, they had been sentinels. And now, the responsibility had shifted to him. The realization hit him with the force of a landslide, if he could tap into this resource, he wouldn't just be the richest man in the valley, he would be the most hunted. The prospect of change, of moving from poverty to power, brought with it a sudden, cold clarity. He was no longer playing a game of survival, he was participating in a high-stakes contest against time and those who would stop at nothing to claim what lay beneath his boots. The morning sun didn't bring warmth, it brought a chilling revelation. Elias stood in the center of the field, his boots caked in the same dust that had defined his misery for years. Now, however, the dust looked like a veil. With the silver-heavy tools in hand, he began to probe the earth according to the map's cryptic instructions. The first strike of the rod into the ground produced a sound that wasn't a dull thud against rock, but a resonant, hollow vibration, a hum that traveled up his arms and rattled his teeth. It was the sound of a heartbeat deep within the crust. He had found it, the vein. He worked with a fervor that bordered on mania. By midday, he had breached the topsoil and struck a layer of limestone so dense it felt like iron. But behind the stone was something that defied logic, a pressurized flow of water, shimmering with a bioluminescent tint, pulsing with the rhythm of an unseen tide. This wasn't just water, it was enriched with rare minerals, a liquid catalyst that had the potential to accelerate growth to a pace that seemed unnatural. As he channeled the stream toward the surface, the effect was instantaneous. Where the water touched the parched earth, the brown, brittle weeds turned a vibrant, deep emerald green within minutes. It was as if the land were waking up from a 1,000-year coma. Elias watched in awe as a stray seed, caught in the moisture, sprouted into a stalk of grain before his eyes, spiraling upward with a speed that defied the laws of biology. This was his "everything changed overnight" moment, but it came with a terrifying catch. The glow of the water cast long, erratic shadows against the surrounding hills, beacons in the dark that were impossible to miss. He wasn't the only one who noticed. From the ridgeline, binoculars glinted. The village hadn't been watching out of pity anymore, they were watching out of predatory curiosity. The transition from a neglected field to a site of inexplicable activity drew eyes from far beyond the valley. He needed to hide the phenomenon, but how do you hide a miracle? He began to construct a perimeter, using the very rocks he had excavated to build a wall that looked, from a distance, like nothing more than a crude attempt at property management. He worked through the night, his muscles screaming, his mind racing. He realized that the tools he had found were designed not just to excavate, but to mask. When he moved the tools in a specific pattern along the perimeter, they emitted a low-frequency hum that seemed to blur the vision of anyone looking toward his property. It was a shroud of sound, a sensory interference that made the field appear mundane, gray, and abandoned to anyone not standing directly inside. His isolation became his armor, but the pressure was mounting. He was no longer just a farmer, he was a gatekeeper. He started to experiment with the water on a larger scale, planting rows of traditional crops to see if the enrichment could be scaled. The results were staggering. By the second day, his field was a jungle of oversized, nutrient-dense produce that looked like it had been grown in a controlled laboratory. He felt a surge of pride, followed immediately by the suffocating realization that he couldn't take this to market. If he sold a single basket of this fruit, the questions would start. The government inspectors, the agricultural conglomerates, the secret societies that always seemed to hunt for anomalies, they would descend like vultures. He was trapped by his own success. The contrast between his former poverty and his newfound potential was so sharp it felt like a physical pain. He had the means to solve every problem he had ever faced, yet he was forced to bury his treasure under a veil of normalcy. He spent his evenings sitting by the glowing vein, questioning the legacy he had inherited. Was this meant to be a boon, or was it a test? The parchment had warned of the burden of the basin. He was beginning to understand that the burden wasn't the work, it was the secrecy. The deeper he delved into the vein, the more he felt like an intruder in a house that didn't belong to him. Then came the first visitor. It wasn't a neighbor, and it wasn't a local official. It was a woman dressed in expensive, utilitarian gear, her presence in this desolate valley as out of place as a diamond in the mud. She walked right up to his fence line. Ignoring the "keep out" signs he had hastily posted. She didn't look at the field. She looked at him, with eyes that seemed to see through his clothes, through his skin, and right into the secret he was keeping. "You've broken the seal," she said, her voice smooth but laced with a threat that made the hair on his arms stand up. "And you have no idea what you've just unleashed upon yourself." The game had changed, and Elias realized he was no longer the one making the rules. He had invited the world to his door, and now, the world was going to demand its share. Elias didn't answer her immediately. He gripped the handle of his spade, the cold iron biting into his palm. The woman didn't blink. She stood there, a jarring silhouette of modern intrusion against the backdrop of his ancient, glowing secret. She introduced herself as Clara, representing a firm whose name sounded like a hollow corporate promise. She didn't offer a bribe, and she didn't offer a partnership. She simply described his life in intimate, terrifying detail. She knew about the cow he had sold, the nights he had spent starving, and the specific hour he had discovered the chest. It wasn't just research, it was surveillance. The realization that he had been watched long before he found the chest settled over him like a suffocating blanket. "The field," she continued, her tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather, "is not yours, Elias. It is a biological battery. You've tapped into a circuit that's been dormant for centuries, and you're currently leaking energy into the atmosphere. Do you have any idea how many satellites are tracking the spike in growth coming from this exact GPS coordinate?" The contrast between his local, dirt under the fingernails existence and the global, high-tech reach of her employers was staggering. He had thought he was a lucky man winning the lottery of geography. In reality, he was a variable in an equation he didn't understand. The forgotten field wasn't forgotten by accident, it was quarantined. Elias realized then that the tools he had found were his only leverage. As long as he held the silver instruments, he could manipulate the energy field, effectively creating a blind spot for their sensors. But for how long? His exhaustion was total. He had been fueled by adrenaline and the promise of a better life, but that promise was rapidly souring into a death sentence. He needed to make a choice, bury the secret again, effectively sealing his fate to remain a destitute farmer, or fight for the control of a power that could potentially feed the world, or destroy it. Clara's presence wasn't just a threat, it was a deadline. He retreated into his farmhouse, leaving her standing by the wire. He needed to consult the parchments again. He found a section he had initially dismissed as a ritualistic warning: he who draws from the vein must provide a vessel for the overflow. It wasn't about selling the crops, it was about distribution. The energy was accumulating. If he didn't find a way to redirect the output, the pressure would eventually breach the surface, causing an ecological disaster that would level the entire valley. He wasn't just a farmer, he was a safety valve. The irony was bitter: the world wanted to exploit him for profit, while the land itself needed him to act as its steward to prevent an explosion. He returned to the field, his resolve hardening. He walked past Clara without speaking and knelt by the epicenter of the flow. He began to adjust the silver tools, not to mask the signal, but to amplify it in a controlled, invisible stream that would disperse into the atmosphere harmlessly. It was a delicate, dangerous dance. As he worked, the ground beneath him trembled. The air grew thick with ozone, and the vibrant colors of his crops began to pulse in sync with his own heartbeat. He felt a connection, a literal, physical tether to the earth. He understood that the sentinels, now. They weren't guarding a treasure, they were maintaining a precarious balance. Clara watched, her composure finally breaking as she pulled out a device that chirped frantically. The readings were spiking, but not in the way she expected. The energy wasn't leaking into the field anymore, it was being channeled through Elias, making him a living conduit. He felt power coursing through him, not just physical strength, but a kind of heightened awareness. He could hear the water flowing deep underground, he could feel the shift in the tectonic plates miles away. He looked at Clara, and for a moment, he didn't feel like a poor farmer. He felt like a titan. "Tell your masters," he said, his voice echoing with an unnatural resonance, "that this land is under new management." The intimidation tactics failed because he had inadvertently tapped into the very thing they were trying to steal. The sheer volatility of the situation made it impossible for her to approach. She stepped back, realizing that the poor farmer was no longer just a man, he was becoming an extension of the field itself. She didn't leave, though. She watched from a distance, documenting the transformation. Elias knew he had bought himself time, but he had also marked himself as an anomaly that could no longer be ignored. He had changed his life overnight, but in doing so, he had invited the most powerful forces on the planet to come and take it back. The shift from being a spectator to a target was complete. By the following morning, the horizon wasn't just filled with the usual rolling hills, it was crowded with the silhouettes of sleek, black SUVs parked along the perimeter of his property. Clara hadn't left, she had been reinforced. The silence of the rural valley was shattered by the low hum of communication arrays and the rhythmic, ominous thud of security drones hovering at the edge of the property line. Elias sat on his porch, a cup of coffee cold in his hand. Watching the encroachment with a grim, detached calm. He was no longer afraid. The connection he had established with the vein had rewritten his own biology. He could sense their intrusion not as a threat, but as a discordant note in the symphony he was now conducting. He walked out to meet them, not with the humility of a farmer, but with the presence of someone who held the keys to the kingdom. A man stepped out of the lead vehicle, tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than Elias's entire farmhouse. This was the director, the man Clara answered to. He didn't approach, he simply waited for Elias to reach the wire. "You've made a significant error in judgment, Elias," the director stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "You think you've claimed a resource. What you've actually done is declare war on the future of energy production. We have the legal standing, the technology, and the military backing to repossess this entire valley within the hour." Elias looked at the man and smiled, a thin, dangerous expression. "Legal standing? You're talking about pieces of paper while I'm standing on a living, breathing miracle. You don't understand the chemistry of this place. You don't understand that if you dig, you won't find gold or oil. You'll find a release of pressure that will level everything for 20 miles. The director paused, his gaze flickering briefly to the vibrating, emerald-hued crops that seemed to watch them with a life of their own. The contrast between their sterile, calculated approach and the raw, untamed vitality of the land was absolute. They were men of industry trying to contain a force of nature. The engagement began in earnest. The drone started a grid scan, firing high-intensity lasers to map the subterranean flow. Elias reacted instantly. He raised the silver tool, now vibrating with a soft, pulsing light, and traced a complex sigil in the air. The earth groaned. A wave of force, invisible but potent, rippled outward from the field, turning the drones into sparks of falling debris. The director stumbled back, shock etched onto his face. "What are you?" he demanded, his composure finally fraying. Elias didn't answer. He turned his attention to the perimeter, expanding the blind spot he had created. He wasn't just hiding the field anymore, he was creating a sanctuary. Inside the circle, the environment shifted. The air became thick with oxygen, vibrant and restorative. Elias walked back toward the center, feeling the pull of the vein. He realized that the forgotten field wasn't a static location, it was a node in a global network of earth energies that had been systematically suppressed by the very people standing at his fence line. They weren't there to harvest the resource, they were there to seal it, to keep the world dependent on their outdated methods of power. The revelation fueled him. He wasn't just protecting a plot of dirt, he was sparking a revolution. The pressure inside him was mounting. He could feel the eyes of the world turning toward his coordinates, not through satellites, but through the ripple effect he was creating. The plants in his field were growing at an exponential rate, their roots acting as conduits for the energy. If he didn't channel this properly, he would become the explosion he was trying to prevent. He began to choreograph the flow, weaving the energy through the roots and out into the atmosphere, creating a shield that was both a defense and a beacon. He was broadcasting the truth of the land to anyone capable of perceiving it. The standoff lasted for hours. The syndicate grew desperate, bringing in heavy machinery that shook the foundations of his house. Elias stood his ground, his connection to the earth serving as his anchor. Every time they tried to drill, the ground would shift, filling their holes with rapid growth vegetation and stone. It was a battle of will between the rigid, sterile machines of the syndicate and the wild, chaotic abundance of the field. And slowly, the syndicate started to retreat, overwhelmed by the sheer, unmanageable life force surging from the Devil's Acre. Elias had won the first round, but he knew the war was just beginning. He looked at the horizon, realizing that he was no longer a farmer waiting for a harvest, but a warden of the most dangerous secret on Earth. The retreat of the syndicate wasn't a surrender, it was a tactical recalibration. As the last of the black SUVs vanished into the dust of the horizon, the silence that returned to the valley felt heavier, weighted with the gravity of what Elias had become. He stood amidst his emerald, pulsating crops, the silver tool now hummed in his hand as if it were a natural extension of his own nervous system. He hadn't just survived the siege, he had fundamentally altered the frequency of the land. The forgotten field was no longer a hidden pocket of resources, it was a lighthouse. And he was the only one capable of keeping it lit. The transition from a desperate farmer to a global catalyst was complete, yet the isolation was absolute. He had won the immediate battle, but the fallout was already beginning to unfold. Across the world, sensors in clandestine laboratories and deep-state listening posts were triggering alarms. He had broadcasted a pulse of raw, clean energy that defied every known thermodynamic model. He knew that tomorrow, the threat wouldn't be a corporate security team, it would be governmental task forces, military might, and perhaps even things he couldn't yet comprehend. The contrast between the simple life he had craved and the cosmic responsibility he now bore was a chasm he could never cross back. He sat on the porch, the cooling night air smelling of ozone and impossible life. He reflected on the path that brought him here, from the hunger, the debt, the laughter of the villagers, to the digging of the hole, and the unearthing of the chest. It was a journey of inches that had covered miles of destiny. He realized that the poor farmer he had been was the perfect disguise. He knew how to tend the land, how to nurture growth, and how to wait for the harvest. He would use those skills now, not for grain or coin, but for the cultivation of a new era. He began to plant the seeds, not of wheat or corn, but of the knowledge contained in the parchments. He would scatter these truths, not for the syndicate to find, but for those who had been waiting for the signal. The engagement tactics were no longer defensive. He needed to be proactive. He spent the remainder of the night writing, translating the complex, bioluminescent symbols into a language that could be understood by anyone who stumbled upon the residue of his power. He was creating a map, a guide for the next generation of sentinels. He knew that the syndicate would eventually return, perhaps with more lethal intent, but he also knew that he had already changed the game. By sharing the secret, he was rendering it untouchable. You cannot hoard what has already been distributed to the collective consciousness. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in colors that seemed to mirror the glow of his field, Elias stood up. He felt the weight of his legacy. He was no longer just Elias, he was the keeper of the basin. The village below was beginning to wake up, the lights flickering on in the houses that had once looked upon him with pity. They would see the change, too. They would see the emerald glow, the unnatural speed of the growth, and they would realize that the Devil's Acre was not a place of death, but the birthplace of a future they had been denied. He knew what he had to do. He would leave. The field had served its purpose as an incubator, but its true power was in its movement, its spread. He gathered the silver tools, the parchments, and a handful of the soil, the source of everything. He had bought a field, and it had bought him a destiny. He looked back at the house one last time, a structure that had been a cage for his poverty and was now a shell for his transformation. He stepped over the wire and walked toward the valley, not as a man running away, but as a seed being carried by the wind to find new, fertile ground. The final chapter of his old life ended the moment he crossed the property line. He was entering a world that was unaware of the treasure it had lost, or the gift that was about to be given. The cycle of the poor farmer was broken, replaced by the enduring, eternal work of the guardian. As he descended the hill, he felt the earth thrum beneath his feet, a rhythmic pulse that echoed his own. He was the catalyst. He was the change. And for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The journey ahead